Before I offer the message today, I'd like to share two readings from the Bible. The first is from Psalm number 138. I give you thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. Before the gods I sing your praise. I bow down towards your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your steadfast love and your faithfulness. For you have exalted your name and your word above everything. On the day I called, you answered me. You increased the strength of my soul. All the peoples of the earth shall praise you, O Lord, for they have heard the words of your mouth. They shall sing the ways of the Lord. For though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he perceives from far away. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve me against my enemies. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me, and your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. And secondly, a passage from Romans chapter 5. Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have also obtained access by faith into his grace, in which we stand, and we rejoice in hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that all suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given for us. Amen. One of the silver linings in this pandemic, for me at least, is it's allowed me to connect with my extended family. Once a month or so, we've gathered on Zoom for an hour or so just to catch up. It includes my brother and sister-in-law who live in Waterloo, my sister and brother-in-law, my parents who live in Toronto, but also my aunt and my cousins who live over in England. The discussion is always interesting, always engaging, and sometimes a little bit heated. Not in a bad way, but when you get people together with different ideas and different thoughts, there's going to be differences of opinions, competing ideas, and so forth. Our most recent Zoom chat was on New Year's Day, and someone raised a great question that I want to raise with you this morning. Now that we're finally in a place where we can see the end of this pandemic, and I know we're not there yet, but where we can feel cautiously optimistic that whether 4 months from now or 6 months or 8 months, we are going to start putting this event behind us. The question was this: when all is said and done, will there be permanent changes in our world, our communities, and even in our lives as a result of what we've gone through? Or will life go back pretty much the same that it was before? Have you ever thought about how you would answer that question? Well, interestingly, we were kind of split on the answer. Some in our Zoom call felt that ultimately, as human beings, we're creatures of habit, and we'll go back to the same patterns and the same routines we always had. The wheels of our lives will fit nicely back into those ruts that we have been putting there for years, even decades of our lives. And isn't there something very nice about that? Because there's some things that we all want to desperately go back to. I was watching the Buffalo Bills football game last Sunday. And by the way, can I just say this? I'm often laughed at because of the sports teams that I follow. I've been a lifelong fan of the Buffalo Bills and the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I've taken a lot of grief for that. But this could be the year where the Buffalo Bills win the Super Bowl and the Leafs win the Stanley Cup. Wouldn't that be amazing? I know some of you are laughing, but we'll see who gets the last laugh. But I was watching the football game, and I noticed that the stadium was completely empty. A stadium that seats, I think, pretty close to 80,000 people, and it was completely empty. And I thought to myself, one of the things that I miss is I miss being part of a crowd. You know, whether it's a sports event or a concert or even a movie. I miss the buzz and the energy of that excitement of all being packed in the same place, enjoying the same event. And that's huge for me because I'm a guy that likes his own space. Don't ever try and share an armrest with me at a movie theater. But I miss that feeling of being shoulder to shoulder, all cheering on the same team or enjoying the same movie or the same show or concert. And I know that those big events are going to be the last thing that come back, and I'm going to have to be patient. But I can't wait for that first sports event or concert or show that I can go to again. And I'm sure if I could ask you what is the biggest thing that you're most looking forward to going back to, you would know the answer to that. I think often in cases it's not necessarily about going places, it's about seeing certain people that you really want to and need to see again in the flesh and not just on your computer screen. So some of us on that Zoom call believe that human nature being what it is, we'll just go back to the same patterns of living, and 2020 will be that nightmare that we finally wake up from, and then we just continue on with our lives. I certainly sympathize with that position. In some ways, I share it, because I do believe that as human beings, we don't willingly change. We can adapt when we have to, and we've seen that we are remarkably resilient, but I don't think we seek it out. We don't willingly always embrace what is new. At least many of us don't. We like our patterns and our routines and our rituals and our traditions and our ways of doing things. And so we should, because that's what gives us a foundation and roots in life. And there's lots of people who will say, if life goes back to exactly how it was in February 2020, I'll be thrilled. And although I sympathize with that view, and although there's a part of me that just wants things to go back to exactly the way they were before, I was actually on the other side of that argument. I think there will be changes. I think there will be permanent changes. And quite frankly, I'll be pretty disappointed if there aren't. Because whether we recognize it or not, or think about it or not, we are being given an opportunity to rethink and reassess and realign things in our world and our community and our thoughts and our lives. It was John F. Kennedy, in a speech way back in the 1950s, even before he became president, in which he said something that many of us now have repeated ourselves. He was talking about that word crisis. And he said that although the word crisis in the Western world is only a negative word, in the Eastern tradition it is not, because the word crisis in Mandarin actually means opportunity. And with that statement, not only would he inspire the people who heard that speech, but he would give motivational speakers and preachers fodder for generations to come. Your crisis is your opportunity. Now, to be fair to the language of that nation, of Mandarin, that really is only half true. There are two letters or characters that make up the word crisis in Mandarin, and they both can stand for many words. Two of the words they represent are danger and opportunity. So Kennedy was correct, but there are many ways in that language to translate the word crisis. But regardless of that, he was onto something. That out of crisis come huge opportunities to learn, to grow, to change, and sometimes to create something new and better. And I think at some level we know that. Maybe we even know it personally. Maybe out of some crisis that you've been through, something really good has come at the end of that. I have a friend who's a minister. He's also an amazing musician. He plays the guitar, and he plays it extremely well. He's the guy on the retreat or the camping trip who brings out the guitar and leads people singing well into the night. Do you know why he plays the guitar? When he was a teenager, he contracted mono, had to spend several days, weeks in his room recovering. This was before the age of cell phones and tablets and Netflix. So having nothing else to do, he picked up a guitar and he taught himself how to play. The result? A lifelong skill that brought joy to him and joy to all others who would share in that gift. I'm sure if you asked him what was one of the best things that ever happened to him in his life, he would tell you it was getting mono. In crisis, there can be opportunity. And what applies to a teenager learning to play the guitar, of course, applies in so many ways, other ways as well. It was Plato who famously said that necessity is the mother of invention. And so it is. We don't often change until we're necessitated to change. But I would argue that if necessity is the mother of invention, crisis is the father of invention. And I think history bears this out. In 2010, an oil rig called Deepwater Horizon exploded and sank off the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe you remember that happening, releasing one of the biggest oil spills in history. With no way to contain the spill, engineers had to think on the fly, and they came up with something called the capping stack. It worked. That invention is now used on oil rigs everywhere as a contingency in case of an oil spill. From crisis came opportunity. If you don't remember that, you surely remember the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990. A horrible conflict, a crisis in every way. What good came out of it? The Madrid Peace Conference, which laid the foundation for every Middle Eastern peace negotiation since. And it goes on. In March 2010, a tsunami hit the coast of Japan, causing 4 of Japan's 6 nuclear reactors at Fukushima to melt down, releasing radiation into the air and the sea. At least one world leader took this to heart. Angela Merkel from Germany reversed her ideas about nuclear energy and announced that by 2022, Germany would close all of its nuclear plants, and Germany also launched a bold initiative to make itself independent of both nuclear power and coal. Today, nearly 60% of Germany's energy production is from renewable resources. From crisis comes opportunity. Or there's the remarkable story of Frank Morris. Struck blind in a freak boxing accident, he was told by his doctors to go home, that he would have to live his life dependent on other people. Frank Morris refused to give up his independence. The result was the development of an organization called the Seeing Eye, which of course today trains seeing eye dogs for those without sight. Crisis can bring opportunities, even pandemics. The last great pandemic before COVID that we often are talking about is the Spanish flu of 1918, a flu so bad it absolutely dwarfs COVID. What good came from it? Many believe it was the catalyst that led to the idea of universal health care. Russia started in 1920 and gradually introduced into other countries, including Canada. It ensured that all would have access to health care. It also gave a boost to the study of epidemiology, or the study of disease, which would give rise to life-saving medicines, including antibiotics. And it launched the idea of global and national public health agencies that could manage future pandemics. I would never argue that we are given crises in life so that we can learn, but we are given the capacity in crisis to draw from them life-changing lessons. And if we don't draw from the crisis of life, wisdom and knowledge and greater understanding, then we've wasted the opportunity that lies in them. Isn't that a little about what the Bible is getting at when it says, suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character leads to hope, and hope does not disappoint. In other words, there can be a process that leads from crisis to opportunity if we allow it. Time will tell if COVID-19 is the nightmare that we forget about and return to life as normal, or whether it produces a new dream or vision of moving forward into the future. But I'm actually more interested in how it affects us in our own lives. So last week I asked this question via Northwest News. What have you learned from COVID-19? I didn't get a lot of responses, but the responses that I got were very good. So for just a couple of moments, as we start this year, that I'm calling the year of hope and healing, I want you to listen to a couple of voices from our congregation. Just a few of them share their wisdom from this past few months. Kathy Tanner sent me this. I've learned so many things through this pandemic year, but here are a few that come to mind. I've learned how much hugs and human touch are needed by humans, and especially a human being like me who loves hugs. The other thing I learned, which we will all continue to use, is the amazing use of technology. Who would have ever thought that Zoom would allow us to connect with everyone we wanted to on special occasions, for meetings or parties or just to chit-chat? This platform was a lifesaver to many this year. Marina Scory told me this: "The lesson I've learned from this pandemic is how important social interactions are to me on a daily basis. From connecting with family and relatives, dropping in at home, friends meeting for lunch, volunteering with a group, sharing in worship at church, exercising a class in the community center, as well as just chatting with total strangers when out shopping. I miss people. Never again will I take a friendly smile or word for granted." Deb Hunt sent me this: "There are many things that 2020 brought me, but one lesson: you can teach an old dog new tricks. I learned more about the computer than I ever have before, having to compose lessons for online teaching, putting together a grade 8 graduation video, and learning all about Zoom and connecting with colleagues and friends." And finally, from Kimberly McKenzie, she writes, "Mindfulness takes intention. With all the bad news, changes, and uncertainty for everyone, all 7 of us in our home, it was especially important as a mother to stay present. If I gave way to feelings of despair, it felt like the entire house would fall apart. At the risk of sounding cliche, reminding myself to take a deep breath and writing down what I was grateful for was extremely important. Living one moment at a time was the very best I could do. I was grateful every day that we had good food and a comfortable house full of people who actually love being together. Being mindful takes a lot of discipline. This moment, right now, that's what matters. Our response to this moment is all we have control over. The past is done. The future is unknown. With every new breath comes a new moment to observe." Oh, and one more. Bonnie Furyk. "Lots of lessons learned," she wrote, "but the biggest and probably the most obvious: take nothing for granted." Nothing was in capital letters. There's more, and I'm going to share those later in another message, but it's good to see some people are already thinking of what positive lessons will come from this as we move forward. So let me tell you where I'm going with this today. Because really this talk today is just a big setup for something so much bigger. For those of you watching, listening today who have been going to Northwest for a while, you know something about me. Those of you who are new or just tuning in, you may not know this. But I've been on a gentle mission in my ministry, especially over the last few years, to challenge us to think about our Christian faith in new ways, to update our language, to refresh our ideas, to discover a faith that isn't separate from the modern world, but is intimately and intricately woven into it. You know, when I read of the life of Jesus, I see him as passionate, prophetic, forward-thinking, radical, even a revolutionary figure. He came to challenge our thinking, to redefine how we are in relationship with each other and the world. He made a big difference. And somewhere along the line, I know I've said this many times, but somewhere along the line, I believe the church in his name lost some of that passion, lost some of that prophecy. Rather than being on the cutting edge, it's allowed itself to be the keeper of the status quo. Rather than investing its resources in dealing with the issues of the day or capturing or articulating a vision for the future, it's busied itself with locking down the traditions of the past. It seemed often more interested in pointing out where people have failed than in nudging us towards those places where we can succeed. What this pandemic has revealed to me is that we need new patterns of thought and action as to how we see our relationship with the world and with each other. It's revealed to be a natural planet that is almost literally crying out for help. It's revealed to me deep-seated injustices in how we have organized our community, how we treat each other. And it's shown me, I think it's shown all of us, the profound need that we have to be in positive and affirming and life-giving relationships with one another. And if our church and our faith is going to have any hope of addressing these real issues, we need to speak with a passionate, positive, and relevant voice. And that's what I want to talk about for the next few Sundays. I started some of this last year in January and February. Maybe you remember we called it 2020 Vision. Got cut short because of the pandemic. So I kind of want to pick up a little bit of where I left off, but going in a different direction. I want to introduce you to a fairly new way of thinking in the church, and I referenced this if you watched the service on December 27th. It's called creation spirituality. It's a way of redefining the language and ideas of our faith in a way that brings it into the modern world, and does it not by changing the faith and philosophy of Jesus, but by recapturing the passion and the purpose by which he lived and taught. The way I want to do this is by contrasting some traditional ideas with some new ways of thinking. For example, in the traditional language of our faith, the way to God is often articulated as through sin, guilt, shame, forgiveness, and redemption. In creation spirituality, the way to God is the journey of gratitude and praise. In the traditional language of our faith, suffering is called the wage of sin. In creator spirituality, suffering is the birth pain of something new. In the traditional language of our faith, humility means to despise yourself. In creation spirituality, humility means to befriend yourself. In the traditional language of our faith, science is unimportant. In creation spirituality, science is vitally important, because by teaching us about nature, it teaches us about the Creator. In the traditional language of our faith, the goal of life is righteousness. In creation spirituality, the goal of life is justice. In the traditional language of our faith, passion is a curse. In creation spirituality, passion is a blessing. The traditional language of our faith can be pessimistic. The language of creation spirituality is very, very hopeful. And so forth and so on. The idea being that faith is not static or traditional or old or ritualistic, but it should be vibrant and relevant and lead to transformed lives in a transformed world. Remember on the 27th, I spoke about life going to the positive, the negative, the creative, and finally the transformative. That's creation spirituality. I'm really excited about exploring this with you over the next few weeks. I want to build together new ways of understanding and articulating our faith that can help us to engage with fresh ideas as we move closer and closer to the end of this period of time. And I have a title for this, but to share it, I first need to share an illustration. In 1945, one of the worst crises in history took place. The Americans, in an attempt to end the Second World War quickly, dropped an atomic bomb in the city of Hiroshima. They didn't see it coming. They couldn't prepare. And the result, as you know, was catastrophic. Dr. Harold Jacobson, who was one of the scientists on the Manhattan Project, remarked that the devastation was so bad that nothing would grow in Hiroshima for the next 70 years. He was wrong. Not 2 months later, in the fall of 1945, months after the bombs were dropped, small green shoots began to appear through the soil. In time they grew, and they opened up into a truly beautiful flower called oleanders. The sight of these colorful flowers gave the people of Hiroshima hope, many believing that they were catalysts for one of the most inspiring recreations of a city in history. Hiroshima decided not to seek revenge or lose themselves in bitterness or resentment, but instead to recreate their city around the concept of peace. In 1949, the mayor of Hiroshima, Shinzo Hemai, proclaimed, "Let us join together to sweep from this earth the horror of war and to build a true and lasting peace." Today, the oleander is the official flower of Hiroshima. They can be seen growing around the dozens of memorials in the city, all dedicated to the pursuit of peace. From crisis can come opportunity. So I'm calling this series simply Out of the Ashes, a renewed faith for a new era. And I invite you to come along on this adventure as we consider what wonderful, new, colorful thoughts and ideas may come from the ashes of these difficult days. For where there is life, there's hope. And hope does not disappoint. For where there is hope, there is always the promise of something more. Amen.